The bioscanner had processed exactly 47,382 students that semester without so much as a hiccup. It hummed along in its sterile alcove like a content metallic pet, dutifully cataloging genetic markers, species classifications, and dietary restrictions with the sort of bureaucratic efficiency that made Kepler 438 by University the pride of the Outer Rim education system. The machine had seen everything: crystalline Zephyrians who breathed methane, aquatic depths dwellers who required pressurized mobility suits, even the occasional hive mind collective that technically counted as one student but arrived in 17 bodies. So when Professor Ketvar, the admissions coordinator, heard the scanner emit what could only be described as a mechanical scream, followed by the sound of several safety protocols engaging simultaneously, he assumed someone had finally tried to register their pet. "Third time this week," Ketvar muttered to his assistant, a nervous Trilopian whose eye stalks twitched at sudden noises. "I keep telling the Cantorian exchange students that their symbiotic fungi don't qualify for separate academic transcripts." But when Ketvar rounded the corner into the registration alcove, he found not an overeager mycological partnership, but a single bipedal figure standing before the scanner with the expression of someone whose coffee order had been inexplicably complicated by quantum mechanics. The figure looked normal. Disturbingly normal. 2 arms, 2 legs, bilateral symmetry, a head positioned in the anatomically predictable location. The sort of basic body plan that suggested either evolutionary efficiency or a remarkable lack of imagination. If Ketvar had been forced to guess, he would have said she belonged to one of those pleasant, agrarian species that specialized in hydroponic agriculture and producing particularly moving wind chime compositions. The scanner, however, was having what could generously be called a nervous breakdown. Warning lights flashed in colors that didn't exist in most species' visual spectrum. The bioscanner's housing had extended emergency barriers, creating a containment field that would have been appropriate for handling unstable antimatter. Most unsettling of all, the display screen was cycling through increasingly alarming classifications at a speed that suggested the machine was having trouble believing its own analysis. Species, unknown. Species, restricted. Species, error. Species, Deathworlder, Earth. Species, error. Species, alert security. "Well," said the figure, reading the display with the air of someone encountering a particularly obtuse automated customer service system. "That's new." Ketvar approached cautiously, his 4 arms instinctively spreading in a defensive posture that his species had developed after millennia of being prey animals. "Excuse me, but what exactly are you?" She turned to face him, and Ketvar immediately understood why the scanner was panicking. Her eyes tracked his movement with a precision that suggested predatory instincts, and when she smiled, it revealed teeth that were clearly designed for tearing flesh. Omnivore dentition, his hindbrain supplied helpfully, which was roughly equivalent to discovering that your houseguest was a barely domesticated apex predator. "Exchange student," she said, as if this explained everything. "Graduate program in comparative literature. I'm supposed to start Professor Vexhai's seminar on post-colonial narrative structures tomorrow, but your scanner seems to think I'm some sort of weapon of mass destruction." Ketvar's assistant chose this moment to notice the display screen and promptly fainted, his eye stalks retracting with a wet snapping sound. The unconscious Trilopian hit the floor with the sort of dramatic flair that suggested either genuine terror or extensive theater training. "Deathworlder," Ketvar whispered, more to himself than to her. The word carried weight in academic circles, the sort of weight usually reserved for theoretical physics concepts that could unmake reality if contemplated too seriously. "But that's..." Those are restricted classifications. Quarantined species. The Galactic Classification Board hasn't confirmed a living Deathworlder specimen in over 300 cycles. I'm sorry, quarantined? The exchange student's voice carried the particular tone of someone who had just discovered that their perfectly reasonable request had somehow triggered a cascading bureaucratic nightmare. I submitted all the proper paperwork, letters of recommendation, academic transcripts, proof of species non-hostility certification. Species non-hostility certification? Ketvar's voice climbed several octaves, a feat that would have been impressive if it weren't so clearly involuntary. You have documentation claiming you're non-hostile? Well, yes. I faint at the sight of blood. I once apologized to a door for walking into it. My undergraduate thesis was on the emotional resonance of pastoral poetry in post-scarcity societies. She gestured helplessly at the scanner's continued hysterics. I really don't understand what the problem is. The problem, as Ketvar's training manual had made abundantly clear, was that Deathworlder species were the galactic equivalent of natural disasters with opposable thumbs. They evolved on planets where the baseline environmental conditions were so catastrophically hostile that simply surviving to reproductive age required becoming an engine of destruction wrapped in skin. They were the sorts of creatures that other creatures invented religions specifically to petition against encountering. And this one wrote poetry. The scanner identifies genetic markers, Ketvar explained, backing away slowly while trying to maintain professional courtesy. It's reading your DNA and cross-referencing it against the Galactic Species Database. According to this, you're from a planet designated as Class 12 Deathworld, which means what, exactly? Ketvar consulted his emergency protocols handbook, a thick volume that he'd never actually expected to need. It means your homeworld is classified as unsurvivable by galactic standards. Hostile environment, aggressive fauna, unstable climate, geological instability, atmospheric toxicity levels that would kill most sentient species within minutes of exposure. The exchange student considered this. We do have hurricanes. And Australia. Australia? It's sort of like if someone took all the most dangerous animals on the planet and put them on an island continent and told them to get creative about killing things. Ketvar made a note in his emergency log. And you consider this normal? Oh, Australia's not normal. That's why it has a reputation. Most of Earth is perfectly pleasant. Sunny beaches, rolling meadows, temperate forests. Very pastoral, great for writing poetry. The scanner chose this moment to emit another mechanical shriek and upgrade its containment protocols. The barrier surrounding the exchange student now resembled something designed to contain a small black hole or an particularly vindictive dark matter entity. Right, Ketvar said, making a decision that he suspected would haunt his performance reviews for decades. I'm going to need to make some calls. 20 minutes later, the registration alcove had been cordoned off with enough warning tape to gift wrap a space station. The university's crisis response team had arrived, along with representatives from the xenobiology department, the ethics committee, and what appeared to be someone from hazardous materials disposal wearing a containment suit that could have doubled as personal spacecraft. The exchange student sat in a provided chair, positioned safely outside the scanner's containment field, reading what appeared to be a book of poetry while the various officials held increasingly frantic consultations. Every few minutes, someone would approach her with a question delivered from what they clearly considered a safe distance. So, when you say your species practices agriculture, inquired Dr. Zektonas from Xenobiology, you mean you cultivate other life forms for consumption? We grow food, yes. And this involves systematically destroying plant life? Well, we harvest crops when they're ready, if that's what you mean. Dr. Zectonus made a note that appeared to be underlined several times. And you consider this morally acceptable? It's food production. Most species need to eat. Most civilized species have evolved beyond the need to consume other organisms, sniffed Professor Velchara from the Ethics Committee. We subsist on synthesized nutritional compounds and pure energy conversion. The exchange student looked up from her book. That sounds incredibly boring. The officials exchanged glances that suggested they were dealing with something far more dangerous than they'd initially assumed. A creature that found violence boring was one thing. A creature that found their entire way of life boring was something else entirely. Perhaps, Ketvar suggested diplomatically, we should convene an emergency faculty meeting. The exchange student turned a page in her book. Should I wait here, or... Oh, you're definitely coming with us, said the representative from Hazardous Materials, activating what appeared to be a mobile containment unit. We're not leaving a Class 12 Deathworlder unsupervised in a public area. I'm really quite harmless, she protested, as the containment unit hummed to life around her. That, said Ketvar, watching the scanner finally power down its emergency protocols, is exactly what makes you terrifying. The emergency faculty meeting convened in Conference Room Omega-7, a space normally reserved for discussions of budget shortfalls and tenure disputes, not existential threats to galactic civilization. The room's holographic displays had been activated to show star charts, classification databases, and what appeared to be several very old books that someone had hastily digitized from the university's restricted archives. 12 department heads occupied the curved seating arrangement, representing what the university catalog optimistically called the full spectrum of galactic intellectual diversity. In practice, this meant 11 herbivorous species and 1 carnivore who only attended faculty meetings because they served excellent algae-based refreshments. The human sat in the center of the room, still enclosed in her mobile containment unit, still reading poetry. Occasionally she would glance up at the assembled academics with the expression of someone watching a particularly unimpressive nature documentary. Chancellor Mordek, a distinguished Altarian whose crystalline head tendrils chimed softly when agitated, called the meeting to order. Colleagues, we face an unprecedented situation. Our bioscanner has identified what appears to be a living representative of the legendary Terran species. Legendary? Professor Kixtaloth from Xenoarchaeology leaned forward, her compound eyes reflecting the room's ambient lighting. Chancellor, with respect, the Terrans aren't legends. They're cautionary tales. There's a difference? Asked Dr. Fenkabar from Philosophy, genuinely curious. Legends inspire. Cautionary tales keep you from making catastrophically poor decisions. Kixtaloth gestured toward her personal display, which showed what appeared to be stone carvings covered in complex pictographs. My species' oldest monuments include warnings about the persistence hunters of the third spiral, bipedal creatures that would track their prey across entire continents, never stopping, never tiring, following their quarry until it collapsed from exhaustion. The human looked up from her book. Oh, that's just jogging. Several faculty members instinctively moved their chairs, further from the containment unit. Jogging, repeated Professor Velchara, tasting the alien word. This is a form of recreational self-torture? It's exercise, cardiovascular health maintenance. You voluntarily stress your circulatory system for entertainment? Well, not entertainment exactly, more like upkeep. The philosophy professor made rapid notes. Fascinating. A species that has weaponized the concept of maintenance. Chancellor Mordek cleared his throat equivalent, producing a sound like wind chimes in a thunderstorm. Perhaps we should consult the cultural archives. Professor Genthway, your people have the oldest continuous historical records. What do the hegemony texts say about Earth? Professor Genthway, an elderly creature that resembled nothing so much as an ambulatory tree, with delusions of grandeur, rustled his leaves thoughtfully. The hegemony chronicles speak of the tool weavers of the outer dark, creatures of such cunning that they could transform any material into weapons. They would take stones from their planet's surface and shape them into implements of war. "You mean like spears and knives?" asked the human. "The texts describe something called nuclear weapons." An uncomfortable silence settled over the conference room. "Right," the human said slowly. "We did figure out atomic fission, but we also invented post-it notes and cat videos, so I'd say it balanced out." "Cat videos?" Dr. Zectonus pulled up a linguistic database on his personal display. "Some form of propaganda featuring domesticated apex predators?" "They're just cute animals doing amusing things for entertainment." "You keep apex predators as pets?" "Cats aren't apex predators. They're just cats." Professor Yexhala, from Cultural Studies, a being that appeared to be constructed entirely of geometric angles, projected a series of images into the center of the room. The Concordance archives reference the pack hunters of the yellow sun, social predators that could coordinate attacks across vast distances using sophisticated communication networks. The images showed primitive cave paintings depicting stick figures surrounding much larger creatures. "That's just hunting," the human said. "Cooperative hunting. Lots of species do that. The archives indicate your species could bring down creatures many times your size using only coordination and primitive tools." "Well, yes, that's how persistence hunting works. You don't need to be bigger than your prey if you're smarter and more patient." Every faculty member present made a note that appeared to involve the word terrifying. Dr. Cole-Mirren, from Theoretical Ethics, raised what might have been a hand, if hands were typically composed of writhing tentacles. The Ethark Codex warns of the world burners, creatures that could render entire planets uninhabitable through industrial contamination. "We prefer the term environmental management challenges," the human replied with remarkable composure. "You have contaminated your own habitat?" "We've had some setbacks. But we're working on it. Renewable energy, conservation efforts, sustainable development practices. You are attempting to repair damage you inflicted upon yourselves?" It seemed like the responsible thing to do. Professor Kixtaloth's compound eyes refracted the room's light into prismatic patterns that suggested deep confusion. "You are saying your species possesses both the capability to destroy worlds and the inclination to fix them?" "I mean, when you put it like that, it sounds more dramatic than it actually is." Chancellor Mordek's head tendrils were now chiming in rapid, agitated sequences. "Dr. Nexqual, what do the military history archives say about Terran combat capabilities?" Dr. Nexqual, the room's single carnivorous representative, had been quietly taking notes throughout the discussion. Her species, the Vraktai, had evolved from ambush predators and possessed what could politely be called a professional interest in warfare. The strategic archives are extensive. References to something called guerrilla warfare, combined arms tactics, psychological warfare, and a concept that roughly translates to mutually assured destruction. "We haven't had a major planetary war in almost 80 years, the human pointed out. 80 years, Dr. Nexqual repeated. "And before that?" "Well, there were some conflicts, but we learned from them. The archives suggest your species has been in a continuous state of warfare for approximately 6,000 years. That's a bit of an oversimplification. There were peaceful periods, art, literature, scientific advancement. We built libraries and universities and wrote symphonies, while simultaneously perfecting the art of killing each other." The human considered this. Multitasking has always been one of our strengths. Professor Velchara leaned forward, her ethical sensibilities clearly engaged. This suggests a species with fundamentally contradictory impulses, simultaneously creative and destructive, cooperative and competitive, intelligent enough to recognize problems and stubborn enough to create them in the first place. That's actually a pretty fair assessment, the human admitted. This is precisely what makes them dangerous, Chancellor Mordek announced, his chimes reaching a crescendo. Unpredictability, a species that defies classification, that cannot be understood through normal behavioral models. The quarantine protocols exist for good reason, added Dr. Zektonis. Some species are simply too volatile for integration into galactic civilization. The human closed her book and looked around the room with an expression that suggested she was reaching the limits of her patience. Has it occurred to anyone that maybe your information about humans is slightly outdated? Or possibly exaggerated? I'm sitting right here, and I'm just a graduate student who writes papers about metaphorical subtext in agricultural poetry. Agricultural poetry? Professor Genthway's leaves rustled with interest. Pastoral literature. Poems about farming and nature and the relationship between civilization and wilderness. You study the philosophical implications of systematic organism cultivation. It's more about the emotional and cultural significance of humanity's relationship with the natural world. The faculty exchanged glances that suggested this was somehow even more disturbing than the warfare discussion. A species that philosophizes about the destruction of other life forms, Professor Velchara murmured. They have turned violence into art. It's not violence, it's agriculture, the human protested. You cultivate other organisms, then terminate their existence, then create artistic works celebrating this process? The human opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. You know what? I think I need to speak to whoever's actually in charge here. Chancellor Mordek's chimes reached a pitch that suggested either profound confusion or an impending nervous breakdown. Perhaps we should consult the historical records more thoroughly before making any administrative decisions. Historical records that are apparently completely wrong about everything, the human muttered, returning to her book. That, said Dr. Nexqual, making a final note in her files, is exactly what a sophisticated predator would say. The xenobiology laboratory occupied an entire floor of the university's research wing, its gleaming surfaces and humming equipment designed to analyze every conceivable form of alien life. What it was not designed for, apparently, was observing a creature that the lab's insurance policy specifically classified as acts of Deathworld. Dr. Zektonis supervised the proceedings from behind a reinforced observation window, speaking through an intercom system typically reserved for handling radioactive specimens. His research team consisted of graduate students who had volunteered primarily because extra credit was extra credit, even if it potentially involved being eaten by a mythological predator. The human had been transferred from her mobile containment unit to something resembling a comfortable living space, if comfortable living spaces typically included motion sensors, atmospheric analyzers, and what appeared to be emergency incineration systems. Subject appears calm, dictated Dr. Zektonis into his recording device. No visible signs of predatory agitation or territorial marking behaviors. I can hear you, the human called from inside the observation chamber. And territorial marking? Really? Standard behavioral assessment protocols, Dr. Zektonis replied through the intercom. We need to establish baseline aggression levels. My baseline aggression level is approximately that of chamomile tea. The graduate students looked confused. One of them, a nervous Pleiadian with too many eyes, consulted a translation database. Chamomile tea appears to be a mild sedative beverage derived from processed plant matter. She ingests other organisms for relaxation, whispered another student. Focus on the behavioral observations, Dr. Zektonis instructed. Initiate Test Protocol Alpha. Pattern Recognition Assessment. The chamber's wall display activated, showing a series of geometric shapes in seemingly random sequences. This was a standard intelligence evaluation, designed to measure cognitive processing capabilities across different sensory modalities. The human glanced at the display, then back at her book. Red triangle, blue circle, green square, red triangle, blue circle, yellow diamond. The pattern shifts to include a new element every 6th iteration while maintaining the basic 3-element rotation. The research team stared at their instruments. The pattern recognition test was designed to take most species at least 20 minutes to solve. She completed it in 14 seconds, announced the Pleiadian student. Note that the subject demonstrates advanced pattern recognition capabilities, Dr. Zektonis dictated, consistent with ambush predator cognitive architecture. It's just basic sequence analysis, the human protested. You showed me colored shapes in a predictable order. Initiate Test Protocol Beta, Persistence Evaluation. A treadmill emerged from the chamber floor, along with monitoring equipment that would track cardiovascular response, fatigue indicators, and muscular efficiency ratings. The human examined the apparatus with the expression of someone who had just been asked to explain why water was wet. You want me to run on a machine? We need to evaluate your species' legendary endurance capabilities. How long? Until you reach exhaustion. The human shrugged and stepped onto the treadmill. She began at a moderate pace, neither sprinting nor dawdling, settling into the sort of steady rhythm that suggested this was a perfectly normal activity. The monitoring equipment dutifully recorded her biological responses, which remained frustratingly stable. After 30 minutes, Dr. Zektonis increased the speed. The human adjusted without apparent effort. After an hour, he increased it again. She kept pace while carrying on a conversation with the research team about the philosophical implications of endurance testing. Most species would have collapsed by now, muttered one of the graduate students. This is just light cardio, the human replied, not even breathing heavily. I usually go for longer runs on weekends. Define longer, Dr. Zektonis requested. Maybe 6 or 8 hours. Depends on the weather and whether I'm exploring somewhere new. The research team exchanged looks that suggested they were witnessing something that violated several fundamental laws of biology. Subject demonstrates supernatural persistence capabilities, Dr. Zektonis dictated, consistent with pursuit predator behavioral patterns. After 2 hours, the human showed no signs of fatigue. After 3 hours, the monitoring equipment began registering readings that suggested either she was some sort of biological engine or the machines needed recalibration. This is impossible, declared the Pleiadian student. No organic creature can maintain this level of exertion without cellular breakdown. Maybe your equipment isn't designed for measuring normal human performance, the human suggested. Dr. Zektonis shut down the treadmill. Initiate Test Protocol Gamma, Environmental Adaptation Assessment. The chamber's atmospheric controls activated, gradually adjusting temperature, humidity, and air pressure to simulate various planetary environments. The idea was to determine the range of conditions the subject could tolerate before requiring environmental support systems. The human barely seemed to notice. Arctic conditions that would freeze most species solid? She mentioned it was refreshing. Desert heat that would dehydrate crystalline life forms? She asked if they had any water bottles. Atmospheric pressure changes that would rupture cellular structures? She said it reminded her of airplane flights. Note that subject demonstrates extraordinary environmental tolerance, Dr. Zektonis recorded, his voice taking on the strained quality of someone whose worldview was undergoing systematic demolition. capable of surviving conditions that would prove lethal to most galactic species. It's just basic homeostasis, the human explained. Humans are pretty adaptable. We live everywhere on Earth, from tropical beaches to Arctic tundra to high-altitude mountains. You occupy multiple environmental niches simultaneously? Well, we don't personally live in all of them at once. Different populations adapt to different regions. Your species has subdivided to conquer diverse habitats? We just moved around a lot. Migration patterns, settlement expansion, that sort of thing. The research team was now frantically cross-referencing their databases, looking for any species that demonstrated similar environmental flexibility. The results were discouraging. Most creatures that could survive such varied conditions were either extinct, legendary, or had been quarantined for being too dangerous to contact. Initiate Test Protocol Delta. Problem-Solving Evaluation. Dr. Zekatonis presented the chamber's occupant with a series of increasingly complex puzzles, mechanical contraptions that required manipulation, logical problems that demanded creative solutions, resource management scenarios that tested strategic thinking. The human approached each challenge with the sort of methodical patience that most species associated with geological processes. She would examine the problem, test various approaches, iterate on partial solutions, and gradually work toward successful completion. More unsettling, she seemed to enjoy the process. "This is interesting," she said, working through a multidimensional spatial reasoning puzzle that had stumped graduate-level engineering students. "It's like a three-dimensional chess problem combined with architectural planning." "You find intellectual challenges entertaining?" asked Dr. Zekatonis. "Problem-solving is satisfying. There's something rewarding about figuring out how things work." The Pleiadian student checked the research protocols. Most species find unsolved problems distressing. Cognitive uncertainty triggers anxiety responses. "Well, uncertainty can be uncomfortable," the human agreed, successfully completing the puzzle. "But that's what makes solving it satisfying." "You derive pleasure from overcoming obstacles? Doesn't everyone?" The research team considered this. Their species tended to avoid obstacles entirely, preferring to live in environments where problems were minimal and solutions were provided by established social systems. "Note that subject demonstrates compulsive problem-solving behavior," Dr. Zekatonis dictated. "Appears driven to find solutions regardless of necessity or personal cost." A new voice crackled through the intercom system, elderly and somewhat amused. "That's because you're not testing a predator, colleagues. You're testing an engineer." Dr. Zekatonis looked up to see Professor Antiquus shuffling into the observation room. The ancient bibliothèque was older than most star systems and had personally witnessed the rise and fall of 17 galactic civilizations. His presence in the xenobiology lab was unprecedented, considering he rarely left the university's historical archives. "Professor Antiquus," Dr. Zekatonis said respectfully, "I didn't realize you were monitoring our research." "Hard to ignore when every alarm system in the building is screaming about Deathworld contamination," Antiquus replied, settling his considerable bulk into an observation chair. "I thought you might benefit from some historical context. You have records about Terran species?" "I have more than records, my dear colleague. I have memories." The human had stopped reading her book and was now listening intently to the conversation outside her chamber. "Memories?" Dr. Zekatonis repeated. "I was part of the original survey team that discovered Earth approximately 400 cycles ago, before the quarantine, before the classification system decided that humans were too dangerous to contact. The revelation hit the laboratory like a small but precisely targeted meteor." "You've actually been to Earth?" the human called through the intercom. Professor Antiquus activated the chamber's communication system directly. "Indeed I have, young scholar." "Lovely planet. Terrible coffee. but remarkable sunsets. What's wrong with our coffee? Nothing's wrong with it. It's just far too stimulating for civilized consumption. Most galactic species consider caffeine a controlled substance. The human stared at him. You quarantined us because of coffee? Oh, heavens, no. Thus, quarantine had nothing to do with your being dangerous. Professor Antiquus chuckled, a sound like ancient paper rustling in cosmic wind. Though I suspect our young xenobiologist here is about to reach some rather alarming conclusions about your predatory nature. Dr. Zectonus looked at his research data, then at the human, then back at Professor Antiquus. If they're not dangerous, then why are they classified as a restricted species? Now that, said Professor Antiquus, is a much more interesting story. Chancellor Mordek's office had not been designed to accommodate revelations that could potentially restructure 4 centuries of galactic policy. Its elegant crystalline surfaces and harmonious proportions were intended for dignified academic discussions, not the complete dismantling of institutional worldviews. Yet here they were, a room full of distinguished faculty members, one confused human, and Professor Antiquus preparing to explain why everything they thought they knew was magnificently wrong. The ancient bibliothèque had requested access to the university's deepest archives, systems so old they predated current classification protocols. Holographic displays now showed documents that most of the faculty had never seen before: survey reports, diplomatic communications, and what appeared to be personal journals written in archaic galactic script. The Earth survey mission of Cycle 7847, Professor Antiquus began, projecting the mission's official seal into the center of the room. 12 research vessels, 43 species represented, the largest xenological expedition in Galactic Council history. Our mandate was to catalog a newly discovered star system with multiple potentially habitable worlds. The human raised her hand. Were we actually habitable? Or did that get exaggerated too? Oh, your planet was absolutely habitable, remarkably so. Stable climate, abundant water, diverse ecosystems, rich mineral deposits. From a galactic colonization perspective, Earth was essentially perfect. Chancellor Mordek's head tendrils chimed nervously. If Earth was such an ideal world, why wasn't it opened for settlement? Professor Antiquus smiled with the sort of expression that suggested the answer was both simpler and more complicated than anyone expected. Because it was already occupied. By humans, who were systematically making the rest of us look incompetent. The room fell silent, except for the soft humming of holographic displays and the distant sound of someone's administrative crisis unfolding in the hallway. Incompetent how? Dr. Zectonus asked carefully. Well, let me give you an example. Professor Antiquus activated a new display showing what appeared to be technical schematics. The survey mission included representatives from the hegemony, widely considered the galaxy's premier engineering civilization. They'd spent 3,000 years perfecting their atmospheric processing technology, which could terraform a planet in approximately 2 centuries. That's quite impressive, admitted Professor Genthway. Indeed. So imagine their surprise when they discovered that humans had already terraformed Earth. But Earth is their homeworld, protested the human. We didn't terraform anything. Exactly. You evolved on a planet that was naturally perfect for supporting complex civilization. No atmospheric modification required, no geological restructuring, no ecosystem engineering. You simply had it. Everything the hegemony had spent millennia learning to create artificially, you possessed as a starting condition. The faculty members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Being outperformed by superior technology was one thing. Being outperformed by accidental good fortune was existentially threatening. The Concordance delegation, Professor Antiquus continued, prided themselves on their advanced communication networks, quantum-entangled relay systems that could coordinate information across light years instantaneously, very sophisticated, very expensive. He activated another display showing primitive electronic devices. Humans had developed something called the Internet, a global communication network that connected every individual on the planet simultaneously, allowing instantaneous information sharing, cultural exchange, and collaborative problem-solving on a planetary scale. Using equipment they'd essentially assembled from rocks and lightning. Rocks and lightning? Chancellor Mordek repeated faintly. Silicon-based semiconductors and electrical current, the human clarified, though when you put it that way, it does sound fairly primitive. Primitive? Professor Antiquus laughed. My dear, you'd created a planet-wide neural network using materials you'd literally dug out of the ground. The Concordance delegation spent 3 days trying to understand how your technology worked before realizing you'd accidentally solved communication problems they hadn't even identified yet. Dr. Nex Qual from Military History leaned forward. What about the warfare capabilities? Surely those posed a legitimate security concern. Ah, yes, the military assessment. Professor Antiquus's expression grew more serious. This was perhaps the most troubling discovery of all. The human shifted uncomfortably in her chair. How troubling are we talking? The Vraktai battle analysts spent weeks studying human military history, expecting to find evidence of a warrior culture that could threaten galactic stability. Professor Antiquus paused. Instead, they found something far more dangerous, which was humans who kept ending wars. The silence that followed this statement was profound enough to have its own gravitational field. Ending wars? Dr. Nexqual's voice carried a note of professional confusion. That's not how warfare works. Apparently, it is for humans, Professor Antiquus replied. The analysts found countless examples of conflicts that should have continued, indefinitely suddenly stopping because humans decided they were pointless. Peace treaties, international law, diplomatic solutions, economic cooperation. Your species kept accidentally inventing ways to make violence obsolete. We're not that peaceful, the human protested. We've had plenty of wars. Yes, but you keep learning from them. Most species either fight until one side is extinct or develop stable aggression patterns that continue indefinitely. Humans do something unprecedented. They get bored with fighting and start looking for more interesting problems to solve. Chancellor Mordek's chimes were now producing sounds that suggested either deep thought or complete systemic breakdown. Professor Antiquus, you're suggesting that humans were quarantined not for being too dangerous, but for being too effective. I'm suggesting that humans were quarantined because every delegation that studied them returned with the same conclusion. Exposure to human problem-solving methods would fundamentally destabilize galactic civilization. The human blinked. Come again? Professor Antiquus activated a final display showing what appeared to be official Galactic Council documentation. The survey mission's final report concluded that humans possessed an unprecedented combination of creativity, persistence, and adaptability that allowed them to solve problems other species considered unsolvable. More troubling, they appeared to do this instinctively, without formal training or institutional guidance. The quarantine protocol was established, he continued, to prevent human solution contamination from spreading throughout the galaxy. The concern was that exposure to human methods would cause other species to abandon their traditional approaches to governance, technology, and social organization. You quarantined us, the human said slowly, to prevent us from accidentally improving things. The classification board felt that galactic civilization had achieved a stable equilibrium. Humans represented an uncontrolled variable that could disrupt thousands of years of carefully maintained institutional frameworks. Dr. Zektonas looked at his research data with dawning comprehension. The bioscanner identified her as a Deathworlder because the classification system was designed to flag humans specifically. Indeed, though I suspect the scanner's recent software updates may have had ulterior motives. Chancellor Mordek's chimes reached a crescendo of realization. The scanner was updated to detect humans because someone wanted to study them. Professor Antiquus nodded approvingly. Very good, Chancellor. It seems someone at this university has been following my research recommendations. Your research recommendations? I've been arguing for decades that the quarantine protocol was based on institutional cowardice rather than legitimate safety concerns. Humans aren't dangerous to galactic civilization. They're threatening to galactic bureaucracy. The human closed her poetry book and looked around the room with an expression of dawning understanding. So the scanner didn't malfunction. It worked exactly as designed. The admissions system was specifically programmed to identify and flag human applicants, Professor Antiquus confirmed. Someone wanted to see what would happen when a human was actually allowed to participate in galactic academic culture. And what did happen? Asked Chancellor Mordek. Professor Antiquus gestured toward the human with obvious satisfaction. A literature student who writes papers about agricultural poetry just spent 3 hours demonstrating cognitive capabilities that our research teams consider supernatural, environmental adaptability that violates basic biological principles and problem-solving instincts that make our most advanced academic challenges look like recreational puzzles. I was just answering questions, the human protested. Exactly. You treated advanced xenobiological research protocols as casual conversation topics. You solved complex engineering problems while discussing the philosophical implications of endurance testing. You approached every challenge as if it were a perfectly normal academic exercise. Chancellor Mordek's crystalline form was now producing harmonious chimes that suggested either enlightenment or complete resignation. So the real question isn't whether she's dangerous to the university. The real question, Professor Antiquus agreed, is whether the university is prepared for the consequences of admitting someone who might accidentally solve problems we didn't know we had. The human reopened her book and settled back in her chair. Well, I'm still planning to write my thesis on pastoral poetry, unless that's somehow threatening to galactic stability too. My dear, Professor Antiquus said with evident delight, I wouldn't be at all surprised if it was. Outside the Chancellor's office, the bioscanner hummed contentedly in its alcove, processing the next semester's registration queue. Its recent software update had been remarkably successful, and according to its diagnostic protocols, everything was functioning exactly as intended. After all, the scanner had never been designed to keep humans out of the university. It had been designed to make sure they got in.